This video starts in a slightly different room from normal because this is just a wee bit too big to fit in the bench under the lighting and the shelf. So this is what we in the UK would call a demijohn. Now there are other names in other countries. I've heard the name carboy used, but in the UK we just traditionally call this a demijohn, and it's used for fermenting your own wine. So that's why on the top is this airlock. Now in the bottom the process of fermentation is actually almost complete with this, and as such the carbon dioxide as it ferments comes up, goes down through this, and then there's some sterile liquid at the bottom here, and it lets the carbon dioxide bubble out but doesn't let any impurities or contaminants in the air go in. Now you can either put these, if your house is warm enough to ferment, you can just like put this out in a shelf or in a cupboard somewhere, but it's more normal to put it on a heated mat. Or in my case I've got it just sitting in this, which is actually a water distiller, but it's been repurposed. What I've got here is a 24 volt transformer which is feeding this socket. This is just a Christmas lighting transformer, and this is designed to normally operate at 240 volts, but when it's plugged into the 24 volt supply it runs much cooler, and it just runs at the perfect temperature. I can touch this and it just feels slightly warm to the touch. And this is just a bit of paper towel stuffed down the edge just to actually stop air circulating down to maximise the keeping this warm. Now this thing here is actually a water distiller, and normally this would not be in here. It would just be filled with the liquid you want to distill, basically water, and you'd put this lid on it, and this lid plugs in here, and it's a 240 volt outlet to this, and at full power this would basically heat the water until it evaporated, and then it would look to go out through this hole in the lid. And once it goes out, it's actually looking to get to this outlet here. But to get there, it has to go through an aluminium spiral, I think it's aluminium, inside with heat fins. And there's a fan on top, which then blows air quite forcibly past those fins and cools it down. So the steam comes up, gets cooled, and then it condenses back into liquid and drips out. And that produces very clean water. It's ideal for chemical processes, or just even for drinking or making your own smoke fluid out of. It's a great source of just very high purity water with all the contaminants left behind. But that's beside the point in this case, because we're more interested in what's fermenting in here at the moment. So let's go back to the bench and discuss that in further detail. So now I'm back at the bench. Let's take a look at what I'm not making. You see, for most people, brewing their own wine would involve either fresh fruit crushed and sugar added and yeast, or it might involve a fruit concentrate like this one with the suitable wine yeast added. And it would brew for quite a long time. You know, it would keep fermenting and bubbling away for weeks, and then when it finally settled down, they'd add fining A and fining B, and then they'd leave it for another week and it would settle out. Then they'd siphon it and bottle it, and it's like, oh, seriously, we've got no time for that shit. So the other alternative to all this complicated stuff for making real wine is to make the trashier wine. And the trashier wine is fundamentally a wash, as it's called. And there's two directions you can go with this. You can make the wash, which is just an alcoholic solution, and then you could add fruit flavourings and basically turn it into a sort of mock wine. Or you could turn it into vodka if you were in a country where distillation was allowed. And what we'd actually do here is use high-speed yeasts to do it. Now these Double Snake and Alcotech Vodka Star yeast, these are the high-speed, high-yield yeasts. They're designed to actually ferment very quickly. They contain a mixture of yeast and nutrient, so the process happens in typically about 1 week. And you do get they also do 24-hour and 48-hour fermentation yeasts that really are quite violently reactive. You know, they really ferment at ultra high speed. However, I chose, because they're not in a super rush, I chose these ones just experimentally, and these came from an eBay supplier, and it turns out they're both made by the same company, although they seem different. It's Hambleton Bard makes these, a sort of yeast specialist. And these are also designed for making batches of 25 litres, which is quite kind of big, because I prefer to make small batches of just the 5 litre, the demijohn. what we'd do here to make these up is, I'll just get the notepad over, I've already drawn the demijohn on it. You'd boil a kettle of water, you would pour a bag of sugar. Now this is a 1 kilogram bag of sugar, which is roughly 2.2 pounds. So you'd put that into the demijohn and you'd add the water in and shake it about, the pre-boiled water, you'd shake it about, and you'd also have another kettle full of water boiling, because the boiling of the water is quite important because it sterilises it. The main thing is you don't want any contaminants that are going to add bad flavours or make the thing turn to vinegar. So you're swirling this around, it dissolves the sugar, and it's also a good idea to get your yeast and to start, sort of kickstart it by adding it to some warm water and just leaving it sitting for a while just so it can get going, you know, give it a stir every so often. Now these sachets are designed to make quite a large quantity, and you don't have to use the whole sachet. If you're just making 1 demijohn worth, you could just use either a fifth, or probably more accurately just use a quarter of it. But make sure you give it a shake first to mix it up before weighing it out quite accurately, because these sachets contain a nutrient and the yeast to actually accelerate, you know, the fermentation. So it is important to actually try and mix it up before you pour off the quantity you want to make a single batch. Once you've got the other kettle of water boiled, you add it in and then you let it cool. You can't add the yeast into it unless it's cooled down to sort of body temperature. Imagine the yeast being like living creatures fundamentally. If you just poured them into the boiling water, it would kill them. So you have to wait till it's at sort of room temperature and then pour it in, the yeast in, give it a swirl round, and then put an airlock in. Now an airlock is just a device that goes in, and it's a sort of, it goes up and then down, then up again. And it fundamentally, just a small amount of liquid is put in the bottom, and it's like a U-bend, like your toilet U-bend to stop the smells coming up from the drains. But the function here is that as the brew in here produces carbon dioxide, and you can see the bubbles coming up, the pressure builds up and it sort of bloops past that small quantity of sterile water, usually with a sterilising agent in it. And it means that the gas can escape, but no impurities and bugs and things can get into it, and it just keeps it sterile again, because sterility is quite important. So once you've done that, you can either, if you've got a warm house, you can just sit it in a dark place and leave it to do its business, and it does it quite quickly. With these yeasts, typically it will go up to 1 bubble in the airlock between 1 and 2 seconds. You know, it's really fast compared to traditional wine and their ordinary yeasts. And they'll go on for about a week, and then there'll suddenly be a very dramatic cut-off that it will suddenly start going down the speed of bubbles that are coming out of the airlock, and that's the point at which it's pretty much ready. And you have a choice at that point. As it is, it'll be an alcoholic liquid, and there'll be possibly a slight element of sweetness left in the sugar. Now, I took some out from that demijohn I showed at the beginning of the video, and I tasted it, and it tasted fundamentally like wine without flavour. It was like fruit-free wine, which you'd expect, and that's the complete opposite of something like this. This is actual wine, but it's had the alcohol removed, and it's just basically, this tastes terrible. It tastes like beetroot juice. It tastes bland and empty, and this is the opposite. This is like the wine that's had the fruit taken out. It's got the bite, but it doesn't have the zing of the fruit, so you kind of want to combine them in a way. And the best way to do that is just to get to treat it as an alcopop and add flavouring and maybe more sugar just to sweeten it up. Now, you might think it's bad drinking liquid with living yeast in it. You can kill the yeast if you want. You get various sort of additives from the wine shops that can be used to kill the yeast, but it's not uncommon to just drink things with the wine yeast in them. It's not like this sort of harmful candida type yeast. It is a specific sort of yeast for wines, and your stomach will deal with it quite quickly itself. You might get a bit gassy if you're just depending on your metabolism, but as it processes yeast, but that's about it. But to add flavour, it could be as simple as Ribena. It could be, I don't know if Ribena is sold around the world. It's a really popular blackcurrant flavoured juice here, and it is just a concentrate. Or you could go and get the tropical fruit punch concentrates, you know, just add them into it and mix to the desired effect. And the element here is that if you drank the juice on its own, it would be okay. It would be sweet fruit juice type thing like that. But when you add the alcohol, it adds an extra depth. And here's the interesting thing. You get this alcohol-free wine, and it just, if you're used to real wine, it's odd. It tastes really odd because it almost tastes flat, like there's a dimension missing. But if you then get a glass of that wine and you add some vodka to it, then it adds it back. It almost like reconstitutes the flavour. It gives it that extra depth. So in that same way, the fruit juices are being given that extra dimension by the addition of this alcoholic base. And if you consider that many of the drinks that are sold, I don't know if you guys ever take a look at Photonic Induction's channel. He and Polar, his sidekick Polar, often drink cider while they're messing about with high voltage electrical stuff. The cider they're drinking is not necessarily real cider, the stuff in the cans. It's manufactured cider, and it's fundamentally this. It's basically a brewed base with apple flavouring and lots of sweeteners and chemicals added. And I have to say, it's very nice. And it's a tradition. It's basically cans of a nice sweet fizzy alcopop, and it's good. But that's basically how you make your fake wine. However, if you want to go one step further, you can distill it, and this is where it gets a bit shady, because the majority of governments around the world like to control things like alcohol and nicotine, and to do that they regulate its use, and they take a percentage of the tax. And on a bottle of real wine, on a typical bottle of wine, you're going to be charged about, say, this bottle, if it was alcoholic, would be about £6 here, but the non-alcoholic one is £3. And likewise, if you had a bottle of rum like this, I paid £12 this today, and probably about £7 or £8 of that is tax. It's the government's cut because they control the whole market for alcohol. So they don't like you distilling your own because it's basically doing them out of profit. Well, we know what the governments are like. The money usually ends up in their pockets. But anyway, if you were to want to distill this yourself, you'd have to either build a still, and if you go on YouTube, you'll find lots of stills, or that water distiller that I showed you earlier on could be used to do that. And I have to say, I'm a bit suspicious that part of the reason they are sold and so widely available on eBay is because they are used for distilling spirits, particularly when you consider, if I draw the base of the water distiller here, slight angle with its lid, and the spout comes out, and then there's a little thing that clips in the bottom, and it's designed to take a charcoal filter, replaceable, just a little bag of charcoal. And is that really needed for distilling water? Does water really carry taste through? I'm not so sure about that. But it's also a bit suspicious that the plastic container it comes with, that sits under, and it's got a tight sealing lid, and it's got a little cap, and it snugs over a hole in that. And there's this little wave pattern at the bottom printed onto the plastic. And it just so happens that if you distill a demijohn, a 5 litre demijohn of this sugar wash with the yeast that's done to about 15%, because that's typically what these yeasts will do. They're a wee bit more, they breed the specific types of yeast to actually be alcohol tolerant. So it's a modest alcohol yeast, and it goes up to about 14, well, it says 14% in this one. This one it says, what does it say? What does it say in this one what it's going to go to? It doesn't really say what it's going to go to. But it will typically be about 14 or 15%. Okay. But if you have a wash, typically even at 12%, and you distill it, then by the time you've poured 750 ml, which is strangely conveniently exactly what one of these traditional bottles holds, then that's what it will yield. It will yield a bottle of that about 40%. And strangely enough, that little ripple at the bottom, that little wave, the top of the crest is exactly 750 millilitres if you pour water into it, which is kind of coincidence maybe. So looking at this still here, if you were in a country that you're allowed to distill, you could pour your wash in to this unit, the container inside. This has a container inside and a heating element underneath, and then it's got a fan in the top with the motor, and then it's got this sort of spiral sort of pipe that then goes out there with the fins on it to actually cool it down. You'd pour that in, pour the wash in, you'd turn it on, and initially it's a good idea to get rid of the first small amount, basically a shot glass of the first stuff that comes out of this, because that's going to contain the most methanol. Now, methanol is this touchy subject. You see, there's this sort of image that if you try distilling your own liquor, you're going to end up with a big tank of methanol, and if you drink it, you're going to go blind. And this seems to be, I'm always suspicious this is spread around part of the government scaremongering to discourage people from distilling their own spirits. In reality, if you were to turn this demijohn of basically wine into, and you can put wine in a distiller, and you can distill wine, and I believe you can even use really crap wine and you can recover the alcohol from it. But you're going to end up with exactly the same amount of methanol to ethanol ratio as you would have had in the original wine. So if, for instance, a typical bottle of wine contains the equivalent to a third of a bottle of vodka in terms of alcohol. And if you consider that you do drink typically a bottle of wine at a sitting, so to speak, then you are drinking a modest quantity of the methanol produced, because when you brew sugar and yeast together with fruit and make wine, then you're going to get some amount of methanol. And methanol is the sort of what they class as the toxic alcohol. The one you're looking for is ethanol, but typically you end up with a small amount of the methanol. So when you actually distill, it's worth just, the first thing that's going to come out is the lighter alcohols, which is the methanol. So it's worth just getting rid of the first shot glass. But if you didn't, if it went in, then being diluted into the larger quantity of ethanol, it kind of takes away the hazard associated with drinking neat methanol. Now, methanol has bad press because people do get methanol poisoning. Usually when they try drinking industrial alcohol, if they've got an alcohol problem and they drink some sort of industrial alcohol as a solvent, and that's bad because when you drink methanol, it gets broken down into formaldehyde in your body, and it then forms an acid, and that can attack certain your nerves, and particularly the optic nerve, which is the bit that the scaremongering goes, oh, it causes blindness. And the treatment for that is actually to administer ethanol, actually literally either drinking vodka, so to speak, or in the hospitals for serious methanol poisoning, they will put in an intravenous drip and they'll actually drip feed them like 10% ethanol in a base liquid. And they're basically, the ethanol just takes priority. It buys more time, so to speak, to allow it, either if it was a small quantity of methanol, to pass through the body, or in the case of larger quantities of ethanol, in the case of like serious drinking of industrial alcohol, it lets them do a blood transfusion and get the methanol out that way. But we're talking lots of methanol. We're not talking the tiny little portion that's found in these things that's not harmful at all, particularly when it's in the ratio with the ethanol in here. But the other, where it does come an issue with people distilling, is if you get the hillbillies doing their moonshine, and they make gallons and gallons and gallons, and they're so impatient that as soon as the first drops come out of the still, which is high methanol content, all the methanol potentially that was in it, then they chug that back straight away. They think, here's the first thing out of the still. That's when there is a risk of getting that, the methanol poisoning. The other situation that is quite common for getting methanol poisoning off liquor is when people have taken, usually, I mean, this happened a lot during Prohibition. That's when the whole image of methanol poisoning and alcohol and going blind thing came out. During Prohibition in America, people were getting drinks and they were lacing them with methanol. They were putting industrial alcohol in them and they were poisoning people. That's where that came from. But the main thing to know is that if you brew sugar and yeast and you make up a standard wash, the amount of methanol is minute. It's not particularly relevant. It's safe, particularly when mixed with the ethanol. It's just worth mentioning that. So if you want to get rid of that, and there is a reason you should get rid of it, then taking one shot glass of the first stuff that comes out is the best bet. And then after that, you're going to get your pure, fairly pure ethanol coming out with a modest water ratio. When you distill, there's a bit of a science to stills. You get the fairly complex systems, or you get this super basic, this sort of water distiller, which is super simple. And what you're actually getting, you're not getting nice tight, you're not getting methanol there and then ethanol there and then just clean water after that. You're actually getting a slight diffusion across them all, right to the very end that, the last dregs come out. If you just left it running, you'd be getting water out, but it would still have little traces of ethanol and methanol in it just because of the sort of low accuracy of something like this. But it's good enough to actually distill out the ethanol that you require. And if you're in a country where that's allowed, then that's how you can make a base liquor. Other things worth mentioning, the methanol, it's worth getting rid of that little bit at the top anyway, because it's believed, and it's not been 100% proven yet, that methanol is the bit that causes hangovers. And the hangover occurs once all the ethanol has been eaten up, because that's when your body then moves on to the methanol, and that's when you get sort of low-level acids travelling through your body. Not enough to cause blindness, but enough to give you a headache, so to speak. That's the theory. I don't know if that's 100% true. But you do get ultra-high purity vodkas. This is rum, this is not vodka, but I'll just use it. Since it's clear, I'll just use it as the demonstration bottle. And you get cheap vodkas, and which probably, I would guess that many of the manufacturers don't make much of an effort to remove the methanol. They just bang it all through, particularly in places where vodka is available in many standards, so to speak. But where you have the sort of higher class vodkas, there's a chance that they do specifically distill it in much more accurate degree, literally controlling the liquid to a very high temperature level, that they can actually deliberately distill out the methanol in a fairly accurate way and get rid of it. And you do get vodkas that are so pure, particularly from Russia, that they are unlikely to give you a hangover, it sounds odd. You just kind of assume that alcohol is going to give you a hangover. But that's fundamentally it. This is how you can make very quickly, in a week. You can either make a wine base for making your own alcopops, or you could make your own vodka if you live in a country where you're allowed to make vodka, distill it. So it's an interesting subject. I'd recommend looking it up on the internet, particularly the people's homemade stills and just their recipes. It's always quite interesting stuff. But it's surprisingly easy if you're allowed to do it. But certainly making the wine base, the wash, and then adding flavouring is legal in most countries. So it's a fairly straightforward thing to do. The distilling is, as I say, depending on the country you're in, you might be allowed to distill a certain amount, or you might not be allowed to at all. It just depends how draconian your government is. But yeah, as I say, it's an interesting subject.